I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1741 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk about some of the strategic results that may come out of this worldwide pandemic, which is driving everybody crazy. If you look at TV, about all they talk about when it comes to the Covid-19 virus are the health issues. How many people are dying, how many people are getting over it, testing, and whatever. And unfortunately, one political party is trying to take advantage of it and achieve their socialistic goals that they couldn't do under normal times. They're trying to sneak in some things that otherwise we wouldn't even consider. There are things happening around the world that otherwise would not be considered, especially over in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a place that most every Vietnam veteran will remain forevermore interested in it because most of us spent some trying times over there. You always seem to have an interest in areas where you go through things like that. North Vietnam used to be our big enemy in the Vietnam War. After we left there, they went in and took over the whole place, killed a bunch of people in the name of the common good for communism. But after a few years, they realized they were mistaken. They were going down the wrong path. They changed their economic system with the Dormoy program, and they became capitalistic. Today, they have one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Their human rights status has lagged a little bit behind their economic status, but it's changing generally. They also have some pretty serious military considerations. That's because of their big neighbor to the north. Their big neighbor, the elephant in the room, is trying to push their way around everywhere. They're like the big bully beating up all the smaller kids. But the smaller kids will only take it for so long. Then they generally rise up against the bully and run him off. Today, a story appeared in the Strategist website, which is a part of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. A Vietnamese writer by the name of Nguyen Quang Dai wrote an article titled, "It's Time for Vietnam and ASEAN to Challenge Beijing in the South China Sea." ASEAN, for your information, stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There's 10 members of that association. They are all small little guys when they go up against China individually, but if they gang up, they think they can have more influence. That's what this story is about. Nguyen Quang Dai is a Hanoi-based writer and a former official in Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He wrote a pretty good article that lays out what's happening over there. It is very likely that this pandemic is going to cause Vietnam to make some changes that's going to be a whole lot better for everybody over there, including the Vietnamese and America and the Australians and everybody else in the area. I'm going to share a portion of that article with you so you can get an idea about what's going on. I'm doing this to hopefully get your mind off the COVID-19 virus situation that as of May the 13th, 2020, seems to be driving everybody crazy. Hopefully, this article will give you a better look at what's going on around the world when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. Let's take a look at a piece of this article. Again, that is titled, "It's Time for Vietnam and ASEAN to Challenge Beijing in the South China Sea." Dateline, Hanoi, Vietnam. The COVID-19 crisis has disrupted U.S. ship deployments. At least 2 U.S. aircraft carriers have had rotations delayed, upsetting the balance of forces between the U.S. and China in the region in China's favor. The COVID-19 crisis is contributing to the erosion of U.S. air and naval dominance in the region and has driven China to take new and bolder actions. In these circumstances, Vietnam and ASEAN need to rethink the institutional basis of ASEAN and consider how it can better protect the security of each country and the ASEAN community. Compared to other ASEAN countries, Vietnam is in a key strategic position and has taken a tougher stance on the South China Sea. In 2020, it has new roles to play as ASEAN chair and as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. China is aware that the harder it pushes Vietnam, the closer Hanoi will move towards the U.S. But China also believes that if it can intimidate Vietnam, it might be able to manipulate ASEAN and keep the U.S. out of the South China Sea. Like that's going to happen. There's concern that China may seek to exploit the global uncertainty and try to take Vietnam's vulnerable offshore resources near Vanguard Bank or park an oil rig or a structure on Whitsun Reef. China may even declare an air defense identification zone in part of the South China Sea. To thwart China's ambitions and to fill the strategic vacuum being left by the U.S., Southeast Asia needs a new regional security architecture. That could take the form of a stronger Quad Plus arrangement in which the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia work more closely on regional security cooperation with New Zealand, South Korea, Vietnam, and possibly Indonesia and Malaysia. Such a grouping also could enable Japan to play a stronger security role in the South China Sea. As we all know, ever since the end of World War II, we have tried to keep Japan on a leash because Japan is a strong and powerful nation when it wants to be. So we had to hold them back, but now might be a time to unleash them and let them go. That was my comment. Former U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster recently wrote that China's ambition is fueled by insecurity and that its outward confidence covers an inner fear. He identified 3 prongs of Chinese strategy: co-option, coercion, and concealment, and in an apparent dig at current U.S. policy, argued that America's strategic narcissism should be replaced by strategic empathy with regional partners. We know how good the Chinese word is, after all the lies they were telling about this virus. The pandemic provides good reason to further reform ASEAN. It has been suggested that Vietnam's ASEAN chairmanship should be extended into 2021 to make up for the time lost in dealing with the pandemic. If that happens, Hanoi could focus on strengthening ASEAN to face the growing strategic challenges in a post-pandemic world. For example, the ASEAN Consensus, the requirement that decisions must be supported by all 10 to be binding, should be replaced with the requirement for a 2/3 majority. The non-interference principle, under which member nations reject outside intervention, should be qualified to allow exceptions to ensure regional security. ASEAN should also take steps to identify itself with the new Indo-Pacific vision to ensure national and regional security, and the new Code of Conduct for the South China Sea should be based on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The harder China pushes ASEAN countries, the faster it will drive them to greater unity to defend their sovereignty. The harder China pushes ASEAN countries, the faster it will drive them to greater unity to defend their sovereignty and vital interest. China wants to divide the ASEAN nations like scattered chopsticks so that it can break them one by one. It wants only bilateral, not multinational negotiations to keep the U.S. and the West out of the region. If China controls the South China Sea, ASEAN will face balkanization with its members vassal states to China. ASEAN countries should put aside their maritime disputes to build a new ASEAN consensus. Vietnam should pursue national and regional institution renovation and shift away from its ideological crossroads where it's caught between the U.S. and China to achieve sustainable economic growth and greater strategic resilience. As Vietnam tries to be less dependent on China on many fronts, it should defend its sovereignty and vital interest in the South China Sea. It should bring the South China Sea dispute to UN forums and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Vietnam and ASEAN, with other partners that share a vision for regional security and stability, should build deterrent capabilities based on their own strengths, international cooperation, and their willingness to fight, like the Vietnamese. Now get this. This is very key, especially coming from a Vietnamese writer. I quote, "Vietnam missed two major opportunities for reform and development in the years after national reunification. The first was the failure to achieve normalization with the U.S. after the Vietnam War. The second was the failure to achieve both economic and political reform after communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. Now, as the pandemic brings both calamity and impetus for change, Vietnam should not lose the third opportunity that this new turning point offers." This story tells us there may be just a few silver linings in this pandemic that's going on. Wouldn't it be very interesting to see Vietnam lead the ASEAN and put China in its place? That could happen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's hope that something good can come out of it other than socialist-inspired changes in this country. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1741 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?